a clinical psychologist. She's an assistant professor and director of the Early Lab at the University of Ottawa. She also holds a research chair in child and youth mental health at CHEO, and leads a really, really impressive, impactful program of research on childhood trauma. So very much aligned with the kind of work that we're trying to catalyze at the Leong Center, and really delighted that she can join us today. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Racine, and then if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll sort of save questions till the end, and then I can call on people to ask them.
Great. I will, I'll start sharing my slides here. And thanks so much, Astrid, for that introduction. I somehow over the weekend managed to start losing my voice a little bit, and I wish I could tell you that it was because I was doing something exciting, but it's not at all. It just came on. But I think so I don't usually sound so sultry. I sound a little bit different, but in any case, you get this version today. So thank you so much for welcoming me. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that here in Ottawa, where I am, I'm on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and they've been the keepers and taking care of our land for a very long time. This is a picture of Ottawa just over the weekend, actually, in the early morning. Spring is soon upon us, and the ice is melting along the canal not too far from where I live. So if you ever come and visit, it's quite a beautiful place. And for those of you who I haven't met, don't know me, I thought I would just give a little introduction about who I am and where I've been, because it helps to be situated and position myself in the work that I do. So I actually did my training in Toronto in the clinical developmental program at York University. Most of my clinical training was all done at CAMH and at Sick Kids with some really wonderful mentors. And then I moved out to Calgary to do my clinical residency as a psychologist at the Alberta Children's Hospital. And then I was having so much fun that I stayed for 7 years and did a postdoc at the Alberta Children's Research Institute with Sherry Madigan and the All Our Families research team with Suzanne Tuff. And then coming up on 2 years ago, I moved with my family to Ottawa. And this is a picture just in front of my office here in Ottawa with the beautiful fall colors. And those are my two little spirits who really inspire a lot of the work that I do. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about why I study childhood adversity. I'll talk about how adversity can be transmitted across generations, as well as risk and protective factors in the face of adversity. And then I'll talk about some community-based projects that we're working on to interrupt these cycles of risk. And then I'm really looking forward to questions that you have and discussion. So some of you may be aware of this, but in Canada, we really could be doing better with regards to children's well-being. In a 2020 report card from UNICEF Canada, we ranked 31st out of 38 wealthy nations, and that's sad. I feel disappointed by that, but also inspired because I think there's really a lot of room to be doing better. And a big reason for this placement is actually related to inequality and some children really struggling and the differences between children who are and who aren't. And these difficulties, especially for children's health and mental health, were exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know, and we've documented in some of our work, increases in mental health concerns for children and youth during the pandemic. And there are a lot of reasons Canadian children may be struggling and why we may see poor mental health and development among children in Canada. And Children First Canada has put out a nice report kind of outlining the top 10 threats to children's health and mental health. And number 4, which is child abuse, is one that I spend a lot of my time focused on. We know that Canadian children, about a third, experience abuse in their childhood, and more than 50% experience some kind of household difficulty, like a parent with a severe mental health problem, a parent with an addiction issue, or some kind of other household difficulty. And we also know that, although through this presentation, I'll talk a lot about the ACEs, which many of you may be aware of, but it really encapsulates mostly abuse, so sexual, physical, emotional abuse and neglect, as well as some other household challenges. But overall, adversity, it can occur in the household, but it also occurs well beyond that. And I think your center is really interested in that and positioned to understand that well. But what you see here, like the roots of the tree, right? These are some of the adversities that are occurring in society. And then now we even have adversities that are occurring at the environmental level, where we can be more concerned about things like natural disasters, climate change, war and displacement, and how that impacts children. We also know poverty and material neglect is on the rise in Canada. And during the pandemic, we were sheltered from a lot of this because of support, governmental support. But since 2002, we're seeing an increase in childhood poverty, which is really concerning. And if you talk to anybody in the community, they'll tell you that the families they're working with are struggling, and that right now is a really hard time, especially for families at the margins, for meeting their basic needs. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about risk and protective factors. And so just to give you a bit of a definition for how we can understand that, is really risk factors are those that occur and dampen or reduce the likelihood of optimal developmental trajectories and outcomes. And what they do is they ultimately lead to inequality in terms of these outcomes, whereas protective factors are ones that help lift kids and families up. And so they're ones that might protect or buffer against poor outcomes, or they may just have a direct positive effect on children's outcomes. So why does all this matter? Why do I study childhood adversity? Well, we know that experiencing adversity in early childhood, which is a critical period and a time of immense developmental changes, really sets the stage for health and mental health difficulties throughout the lifespan. And in terms of attributable risk, I think it's more than 40% with regards to psychiatric illness can be attributed to some challenging outcomes in childhood. So really, it's really important to pay attention to these. Also makes good economic sense because we know that there's a high return on investment for dollars that are spent in early childhood. And really, we could save ourselves a lot of money if we attended to this a little bit more. In my research group, we're really concerned with understanding why some children flourish in the face of adversity while others continue to struggle, with the idea being that if we can understand what are some of the either preventative approaches, interventions, and protective factors that can help kids when they face these adversities, then maybe we can increase the number of children that flourish and ultimately promote better health and mental health for kids in Canada. The reality is studying this is very complicated. And so, of course, we have to take into consideration intergenerational effects. So we have this child over here, the one that's in the concentric circles. So we're thinking about what's going on at the level, that child's individual level, their family level, the broader level of society. There's also what happened in the generation before them and what their parents' experiences were, because we know that parents are proximal to their kids and one of the most important influences with regards to their development and health. We also know that There may be, say, direct effects of adversity on a child or direct effects of adversity across generations, but there are also many mediating mechanisms that are happening, as well as different moderators, things like protective factors. So in our group, we're really concerned with understanding these different processes so that we can inform what's happening in community. And oftentimes we actually learn a lot from what's happening in community about these different processes. So how is childhood adversity transmitted across generations? So a lot of research has documented the direct association between early childhood adversity and poor outcomes in adulthood, including physical, behavioral outcomes, and even outcomes in childhood also. So these are just, these little dots represent studies and demonstrating their effect size for these different outcomes. That being said, as I was mentioning, oftentimes when kids are exposed to maltreatment or high levels of adversity, this occurs in a context. And we know from our own research that children who are seen for maltreatment or abuse-related challenges clinically, more than 60 or 65% of these kids' parents also had those experiences when they were kids. And this really elegant research by Claudia Boos and colleagues is theoretical about how transmission from maternal exposure of adversity may be transmitted to her offspring. Specifically, they're looking at prenatal processes, so how prenatal programming may occur. And they look at that these may happen at the psychological, biological, biophysical, and behavioral levels. Now, what's somewhat been less understood or studied is in the postnatal environment, which is really important. How is adversity transmitted across generations? So we know that there may be a programming effect. So how does adversity get under the skin? But there's also what's happening in the postnatal environment in terms of, say, parental mental health, parental support, and so there are a number of different factors that we can examine there, which is something that I was really interested in understanding. So using a large cohort, a prospective pregnancy cohort of women, about 3,000 or 2,000 of them from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, called the All Our Families cohort, we sought to answer some of these questions. So moms were followed twice in pregnancy when their kids were 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and at 8 years of age. And I'll share some findings from each. The kids are 13 now, and we've been following them ever since. The cool thing is that now it's actually an intergenerational cohort. So we're asking the kids questions. They can report on themselves. This is a community sample. So it represents women and families who are in Calgary, Alberta. It's not a high-risk sample. And so I think the demographics of who's in the sample itself reflect that. So mothers retrospectively reported on their experiences of adversity in childhood, including abuse and household challenges. And then in pregnancy, we had a cumulative measure of their psychosocial risks. So things like mental health difficulties, as well as social support, and as well as socioeconomic risks. So things like income and education. From mom's health records that we linked to, we also had a sense of the health risks that moms experienced in pregnancy. So things like that you'd see like on their antepartum risk measurements, so things like gestational diabetes, placenta previa, etc. And we also had a cumulative assessment of the infant's health at birth from the health record. When the babies were 4 months postpartum, again, we had a measurement of psychosocial risk, including mental health and social support. We also had moms self-report on their parenting behavior. And then at 12 months, moms completed the ages and stages questionnaire, which is it's a common measure of children's developmental milestones that's often used in pediatric practice. And we estimated a path model to kind of see different direct and indirect effects of these different variables. But what I'm going to do is break this down in a more simple way. So we found evidence for a biological pathway whereby maternal ACEs predicted higher levels of pregnancy risk for mothers, which was associated with increased infant health risk, which subsequently was associated with lower infant development scores. The second indirect pathway that we saw was that moms who had higher ACEs had higher psychosocial risk, so more likely to have mental health difficulties, low levels of social support, which was subsequently associated with moms using increased levels of hostility in their parenting, which then predicted lower infant development scores. And after we accounted for these two pathways, we no longer saw a direct effect between maternal ACEs and infant development outcomes. And so what this told us is that there are important intermediary pathways by which maternal adversity from her own childhood is transmitted to her offsprings. By considering psychosocial risk, what we saw is there are important equity stratifiers in pregnancy. So things like mental health difficulties and social support that play a role in transmission. And then finally, that parenting behavior may actually be, because it's along the pathway, might be an important intervention target postpartum. And I think arguably may actually be something to attend to in pregnancy and supporting mothers then. And so I think what we came to understand from this work is really at a certain point, you have to go upstream. That it's not just about seeing, oh, why are kids struggling, especially ones whose families have had long histories of intergenerational risk. What are some things that we can do early on? What are ways that we can intervene early that can really support and capitalize on strengths among these families? And in the latter part of the presentation, I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the interventions that we're working with and that we're learning from. Related to this work, we also subsequently partnered with maternity clinic in Calgary, Alberta. One of their lead physicians, Teresa Killam, she saw some of the work we're doing and she reached out and she said, you know, I feel like there must be something that we could do at a clinic level that would be helpful. And so we actually implemented a trauma-informed care initiative to be asking moms in pregnancy about their experiences of adversity. And subsequently, they developed care pathways where they were actually referring moms for support for the ones who found that those experiences were still impacting them. And when we did a case file review, what we actually saw was that for moms who had received this trauma-informed care approach, we actually saw improved birth outcomes among those mothers. The effect sizes weren't very large, but nevertheless, this was a very clinician-driven initiative that subsequently, I think, led to some positive outcomes. So to wrap up this part on the intergenerational transmission, certainly the pre and postnatal environments provide unique times of opportunity for intervention. Trauma-informed care initiatives can be helpful, and early identification and implementation of parenting supports as well. And this graph here on the left comes from James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate in economics. And a few years ago, he had this graph, and the whole idea is like the earlier you invest, the better the return on investment. And he didn't always have the prenatal column. That's a recent addition. But certainly, I think some of this work really supports that and the need for intervening early. So now I'll shift gears and talk a little bit about protective factors in the face of adversity. So as I mentioned, we know that exposure to adversity, whether it be for moms or for children later down the line in the second generation, these exposures are not deterministic. And that's one of the really important points, especially when so much of the research is focused on having had these experiences in childhood and then subsequent negative outcomes. So it's important for us to think about, okay, what actually might be factors across the social ecology, individual, family, community, and societal levels that can help interrupt some of these pathways. So in our own research, we had found that the effect size or association between parental ACEs and children's mental health difficulties. This was a meta-analysis that the effect size is about 0.2, which is small, right? There's not a big effect size. And what it tells us is there's other things going on. And there are opportunities for interrupting these pathways. So to investigate this, we had a question about whether child protective factors can mitigate the intergenerational transmission of maltreatment. And to answer this question, a postdoc in my lab, Jessica Turgeon, did analyses again using the same cohort that I had talked to you about, the All Our Families cohort. But this time, she was looking a little later in development. So she was looking at kids internalizing and externalizing difficulties, anxiety and depression at 10 and a half years of age, and whether or not children's protective factors as measured using the Basque resilience scale would play a role here. And items on that resilience scale are things like the child's ability to self-regulate, the child's ability to reach out for help, the child's ability to return to baseline after experiencing challenge. And so these are really things at the individual level of the child. And what Jessica found was actually among children who had high levels of perceived protective factors that the relationship between maternal adverse childhood experiences and children's depression and anxiety symptoms was reduced. And so we saw a moderation effect of these children's protective factors. Moving on to a more clinical setting, I'm going to share with you some findings that we have from collaboration with Luna, the Child Advocacy Center in Calgary. And this is a center, it was previously the Sheldon Kennedy Child Advocacy Center. And this is a center where children are referred who have really experienced the most severe forms of adversity. So about 60 to 70% of kids have been sexually abused. That's as a primary abuse indicator, but they have been exposed to cumulative risk. So most have multiple exposures to various forms of maltreatment. And we set up this source study to really understand what factors may be playing a role in kids' resilience and how they flourish even after having these experiences. So kids are referred here for assessment and subsequently treatment of significant trauma symptoms. So what we're looking at here is in second generation of kids, when they've experienced adversity, what protective factors might help break or disrupt the impact of those experiences. So this project, we undertook a retrospective file review of 176 kids who were referred to this center. And we extracted data on the adverse childhood experiences that they had, as well as the different resilience or protective factors that they had in place. So things like personal skills, if they had peer support, adequate social skills, those are all at the individual level. We looked to see if they had a caregiver who provided physical and emotional support, as well as whether or not they received support from their spiritual body or community within the education system. So say from a teacher, from a coach, or culturally. Now, what we found among these kids was that 61% of them had mothers who had had their own abuse experiences. And so the intergenerational continuity of exposure to maltreatment was quite high. We also saw these categories here are not mutually exclusive. So they had been exposed to several different adversities. On average, kids were about 10 years of age, and they were diverse in terms of their ethnic and racial identity, and the majority were female. From the files, we extracted information through their assessments related to a number of different trauma symptoms that present and that are associated with a diagnosis of PTSD. And what we found was actually quite high levels of these trauma symptoms in kids within this setting, with about 60% experiencing nightmares, more than half having clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and a third presenting with suicidal thoughts. And when we look to see whether or not protective factors, so cumulatively, both at the individual, family, and community level, moderated the effects of household dysfunction and maltreatment on trauma symptoms, we found, in fact, that it did. So kids who had these protective factors, the association was actually dampened between the exposures that they had and the trauma symptoms that they developed. So what this tells us is that protective factors can help disrupt or break intergenerational cycles of adversity, and they can also mitigate the development of trauma symptoms among kids who have been exposed to high levels of adversity. So moving on to some of the community projects that are really important and can be helpful in breaking intergenerational cycles of adversity. I want to start by sharing a study that motivated some of parts of the reasons why I started engaging in more prevention and intervention type works. When we look at trauma research generally, only 6% of studies focus on treatments, and even less, 2%, focus on preventative interventions. And this just seems so backwards because it's, we've well established the association that exists between adversity and outcomes. And so I think the time is now to move into understanding what we can do about it. And even more importantly, how we might prevent these exposures from happening again and across generations. So I'll talk a little bit about 4 different projects that we're working on, and they all involve intervening or trying to disrupt this cascade at different points. So I'll talk a little bit about the Breaking the Cycle program, which is one that's delivered in pregnancy and also in the postpartum with children under the age of 6. Talk about Make the Connection, which is a parenting program delivered in early infancy to parents to help foster secure attachment with their children. And then I'll talk about the COPE project and Into the Wild, which are projects that are for and developed for children who have experienced adversity in their own lives and trying to mitigate development of mental health challenges. So Breaking the Cycle is a program. It's an early intervention program in Toronto, actually, and our core partner in a project, an implementation science project, where we're looking to understand how this program, which is really multifactorial, it addresses maternal substance use issues, the parent-child relationship, and tries to promote healthy child development in the face of really high levels of risk and adversity. It is a project that involves a number of different partners and institutions. And really, the ultimate goal is to understand for mothers who are part of this program, what are the key ingredients, or what are the magic ingredients that help women who are substance involved and but ultimately make changes in their lives that result in a reduction in risk exposure for their infants and young children, and ultimately better outcomes for their kids. So for this project, there are two main sites, the Breaking the Cycle site in Toronto and a comparison site in BC. And what we're looking at is the comparison site in BC very much has a maternal focus. So they address mom's health and addictions and mental health, but there is not a focus on infant mental health, child development, and parenting support. And we hypothesized that actually that framework and the parenting support itself is integral to better outcomes for the children. So as part of this project, the first part is an effectiveness trial where we're looking at the impact of these two programs on substance-involved women and their young children with 12-month and 24-month follow-ups. And then based on what we learn in the first part of the study, we're actually going to implement those components at 2 or 3 other sites that are across Canada that have a similar clientele, are providing services to women who are substance involved, but are intending and are currently parenting. And what we hypothesize is that that we'll see improvements, but also and a maintenance of good development outcomes among the kids, and decreased levels of household adversity for the kids in the second generation. So now I'll talk to you a little bit about an intervention called Make the Connection, which is in partnership with Strong Minds, Strong Kids, Psychology Canada. It is an intervention that is designed to be delivered to community samples, so to broader population, not necessarily parents at risk or parents who are struggling, but certainly many parents can benefit. And the idea is that it provides information for parents about how to bolster the parent-child attachment relationship. This intervention was previously delivered in person and was recently adapted to an online version that's self-guided by parents, so it's not facilitated. And we're currently running a trial to evaluate that program. So this gives you a little bit of a sense. The previous in-person evaluation demonstrated improvements in parenting self-confidence, improvements in parent perception of their relationship with their child, and overall parenting attitudes. So now what we're looking at is if this program is still delivered online and parents access it themselves, are we seeing the same beneficial effects? And we're particularly interested in looking at parenting stress, parent sense of attachment to their child, parent self-confidence, and also parent mental health. So I have a brief video that I'll share with you that gives you a little bit of a sense of the Make the Connection program.
Psychologists know that the first 3 years of an infant's life are critical in terms of their brain development. Making and forming a secure attachment relationship with your child is vital for this healthy development. And when you form a secure attachment with your child, you're helping them to build lifelong development skills.
The 7 pillars of the Make the Connection program were designed to help you build a secure attachment with your baby within the first 3 years of your baby's life. It is because psychologists recognize that the first 3 years are so important for a baby's development that the Make the Connection program was formed. Throughout the program, you will find engaging videos that deliver valuable information and entertain you at the same time. We have included lots of interactive activities that are packed with tips and tricks to help you on your journey. You'll also find a toolbox full of printable resources that you can use when you can't be online. The Make the Connection program can be completed on any modern browser. All you need is an internet connection. We know that having young children can make for a very busy life. That is why this online program was designed to work around your schedule. At the end of this exciting program, you will be on your way to forming a secure attachment relationship with your baby.
Don't play the video again. I just want to skip ahead 1 second. There we go. So I think what you can see from that video are just the components of the intervention. And so far, what we've heard from parents in terms of feedback is that they, our qualitative assessments are that they appreciate the program, that they're enjoying it. Many have spoken about the importance of having perhaps a peer support component or an interactive component that goes along with it. And so that certainly is a future direction and something that we're really interested in as well. I think the nature of the program, of it being self-delivered and self-guided, obviously, I don't think that that's necessarily something that works for everyone, or many families require higher levels of intervention and support. And so how can this resource be used, let's say by clinicians and early interventionists, is something we're also interested in exploring next. 2 other projects that we're involved in. One is the COPE project, which is really came out of an uptick in wait lists for trauma services for kids during the pandemic. We don't have good data on whether child abuse and neglect increased during the pandemic, but we certainly do know that the risk factors for them did. And there are a lot of indirect indicators like increases in kids' cell phone calls and things of the like that would lead us to believe that perhaps there was an increase, or at least among certain families there may have been. And so our partner, the Luna Center, actually saw their wait list increase substantially during the pandemic. And so the development of the COPE website is a waitlist intervention. So it's actually usually, and as a psychologist who works in trauma treatment, I know this, you have a family that's referred to you. And the first thing you do with them is you provide them with psychoeducation. You tell them about what trauma is, its impact on the brain, its impact on emotions, and you teach them a number of skills, emotion regulation skills to help manage distress. And it seems like something really that we could share with people, way before they end up in an office like mine. And so that's exactly what this is a portal of brief videos and of information for caregivers about how to support their child, and psychoeducation for caregivers. We'll be developing a different version that is informed by youth, for youth, about what they would like to see but we're in the process of evaluating an implementation trial for that. And just for the sake of time, I'll skip the COPE video and tell you a little bit about Into the Wild, because I want to leave a good amount of time for us to discuss and to answer people's questions. In this study, this was one that was sponsored by CHEO and the Children's and the CHEO Research Institute. Last summer, we had the opportunity to send 32 kids from the Vanier Social Pediatrics Hub, which is hub in Vanier here in Ottawa, which is by one of the most underserved communities. Majority of children referred to the pediatric hub are new Canadians. They are presenting with a number of social and behavioral challenges, and most families are quite economically disadvantaged and facing a lot of challenge. So the idea is they're referred to this hub, and then there's a social prescription. So they see a pediatrician who talks to them about what their goals and their dreams might be, in addition to addressing, perhaps medication or diagnostic needs that they have. And so 32 kids were actually referred to attend this camp that was delivered by the Canadian Museum of Nature. And we did a small pilot evaluation of this. We had both qualitative and quantitative outcomes, and we saw small to moderate effects in terms of improvements in their kids' emotional state, their social contact, and overall reports of well-being. What's really interesting, when we actually asked the kids about the camp, what were the things that they liked, many of them who, because of where they live and because of the resources that their families have, had very limited exposure to nature and the potential benefits. And so there was good and bad actually about that, because some of the kids were like, had exposure to, say, bugs and all kinds of things that they didn't necessarily appreciate. But certainly a big majority shared about the friendships they developed, a shift in their identity around no longer being the kid who just stays at home, and about making friends and feeling like actually making friends is something that they are capable and able to do. So this kind of wraps things up and ends things. And I think, just to conclude, I just want to say that addressing the mental health of implications of children who are exposed to adversity certainly is multifaceted. In our research group, we're really invested in understanding how intervening early and programs that are involved early can have a positive and beneficial impact to disrupt negative cascades for kids who are exposed to adversity, and the importance of going upstream and how that may have the greatest impact. Of course, none of this work is done in isolation. It's done with a team of wonderful individuals and students and collaborators who work really hard, and funders for the work. So what I'll do is I can stop sharing now, and then we can have time for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Racine. It's a great talk. I'll open it up to people. There are a lot of people on the call, which is amazing. Let me just make sure that I'm going to be able to see people's hands. Hopefully I will be able to. Maybe I'll start. I'm wondering what your reflections are on the uptake of some of your evidence to, the population, and to public health programming, for instance. Like, I just reflect a little bit on, and we have somebody from Public Health Ontario, on the line, but just thinking about, even the Healthy Babies, Healthy Children program in our province, which, is not based on the actual trial evidence of the nurse home visitors. So just curious about how you're thinking about, as you're generating much of this evidence, and then thinking about that, like moving it into, sort of routine programming.
Yeah, and thanks for that question. I think is really important, because I was recently on a panel with Ottawa Public Health and different people and within government, kind of talking about just this, like what are the programs that we're actually implementing? What evidence do we have for the ones that are being used? And I think the reality is, a lot of what is being done, I would imagine, and I think from people's anecdotal evidence, is helpful. But I think is always room for us to have a better sense of that, and certainly to do a better job of evaluating. So, for example, even the early on centers that we have here in Ottawa, we've started working more closely with them to understand that that's a huge investment, right, from the perspective of government. But we have no idea who attends those and whether or not they're helpful for people. And that's would be important to know. And many early ons actually have different programs that they implement, but also who are they serving? Because a big question remains around, especially families who are at the margins, new Canadian families, refugee families who settle here in Ontario and beyond, whether or not they're accessing the services and find them helpful, and what adaptations we need to do for the services then to be reached.
Yeah. Jennifer?
Hi, wonderful talk as always. Thanks so much. And my question, your talk was really wonderful and focused on the intervention side. So I'm happy to bring this question offline if it makes more sense. But I think so many of us who work with families and children and youth, our knowledge of this and awareness of the impact and the need to sort of be thinking about it. My question sort of comes around measurement, and particularly with youth and slightly older youth, and at what point we start to ask youth about these experiences versus focusing on parents, and whether or not you have any thoughts on that. I know many researchers are sort of grappling with understanding the importance of it, but also the sensitivity of it, and how to do that both clinically and from a research perspective in a useful way. If you have any thoughts around that, it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly something that different people have brought forward. Like, I know have had lots of conversations with Joe Henderson about this, who's been thinking about how, within the different youth hubs, like, how do we ask about these questions? How would you do it in a way that, is sensitive, and also like, what implications does that have? And then even when you're doing research, like the REBs, right? If you're asking questions like this, what the implications might be. And so I know within some of our own research that involves youth, we will be asking some of these questions among the older youth, like 14, 15, 16. It is in younger children, it's hard because certainly there are a lot of implications of asking, and oftentimes, depending on the nature of the research that you're doing, there can be oftentimes we're having to ask the parents. So I guess I don't necessarily feel like I have a magic answer about how we best do that. I know in some of the clinical populations that we're working with, it's cases where, say, these experiences have already been disclosed, have already been asked about. And so then, we can kind of collect the information after the fact, but we may not necessarily be the first ones asking.
Right. Okay.
And
great.
Yeah, when we do that, we found that to be at least then positioned clinically in a place where they'll get support. And it's also, if we're collecting information that may already be being collected from a clinical perspective, then us asking about it is more trauma informed. I guess we're not asking twice.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, great. I know it's complicated, but yeah, that was all we had to, hoping to get some thoughts. So that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
And then in a similar vein, so there are two people with hands up, but Sarah Carsley, who's actually from PSO, had typed a question.
Right.
Sarah, do you want to ask your question? Or do you want me to read it out?
No, sure, I can.
Yeah.
Can you hear
Amazing.
me?
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, so hi, Sarah Carsley from Public Health Ontario, and I chair the ACEs and Resilience Community of Practice in Ontario.
Oh, great.
And we struggle, population assessment and surveillance is core to our public health practice, but we're struggling with seeing if it's important to do sort of surveillance on ACEs, seeing as the global prevalence has been well established, as you mentioned in your, data on, we know
Yeah.
the damage, we know all that stuff, and there's no reason to suspect that Ontario is probably different. But how do we at a community level for public health understand what's going on locally in our own communities? Are there standardized indicators that we can be measuring? And that will also help us understand the impact that we're going to make through our programming.
Yeah. So, and I think this is such an important question. And I think maybe, say, for example, measures, and of course, like the 10 ACE item that I talked about, that's been expanded upon, right? Like the WHO's put out a more expanded version that actually captures things like bullying, racial victimization, violence that happens in communities, which are all such important risk factors to also consider. We've written about I guess what we call like ACEs screening, or asking about it, and in the absence of doing something about it or being able to have support that's provided or supported conversations, it may not necessarily be indicated, right, from a public health standpoint. And there are some uh, health authorities that have implemented asking these questions and then documenting it in the health record, and others that have not. I don't think there's not right now good evidence that that screening itself or asking itself will have that will change anything, right? So in the absence of actually there being like a program that you're evaluating or interested in understanding, just asking the questions themselves won't necessarily be helpful. So I think maybe from a measurement standpoint, it's like, what do you want to see change? What do you hope changes? And based on what you're doing, what do you think will change? And I think that can really drive what kind of questions can be asked.
Thank you.
And then all the questions about where they get asked and how,
Yeah.
and who's collecting the data. But yeah, no, for sure. I think Teresa's next, and then Peter, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That's a great talk. I really enjoyed it. We recently did a study using latent class approach, and we
Yeah.
were able to identify mother and child pair with high risk of having early childhood physical illness like asthma, allergic rhinitis, and so forth. And one of the interesting factors we found was access to green space. So your talk on the wild cam is very kind of interesting to me. So obviously there's a lot more evidence, mounting evidence to show that access to green space really matters. So I wonder whether have a wild cam program is great, but it's difficult to manage if the number of kids involved is huge. So what's your thoughts about, working with schools to have a much wider and more wider and more frequent access to green space program built into their curriculum? You think that may be beneficial, and is that you think is doable?
Yeah, I mean, I think so thanks for the comment and for sharing your finding. I think is really interesting, and certainly I think there are a lot of other people in this area of research who probably know much more than me. But whether it be within the school context or even at a broader city level, like what our environments look like for all families, what access do people have that's close to green spaces? Because when you look like the inequality between low income neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are higher income, there's vast differences in terms of what those environments look like in terms of access. And so I think the school is certainly one part of the social ecology, but I think as much as possible having an impact in terms of like actual city planning and you know, where social housing is and what it looks like and what those environments look like, I think is really important.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Great. And last question, Peter.
Thanks, Astrid and Nicole. A great talk. Your work is so methodologically sophisticated. I have a methodologic question, and that has to do with the appropriateness of a cumulative risk score
Yeah.
and the assumption that each risk factor is of equal value and that the relationship is linear over time. And I wonder, do you think that that's possibly an oversimplification of a much more complex set of relationships, and that there might be certain combinations of risk factors that are way more important than others?
Yeah. And thank you, Peter, for that question. And certainly, I think the idea of cumulative risk and I guess the theory behind it is as much as you know, there's important historical evidence related to that. I think what we're starting to certainly understand is exactly what you're saying. That there are certain risk factors that may have more weight than others, and then also the developmental timing of those risk factors when they occur. So yes, this is I think an oversimplification. I think there's always room for a more nuanced approach and understanding. And interestingly, even like dimensional models of diversity exposure show that say neglect has a different impact on the developing brain than threat does. And then the pathways for that in terms of what the outcome ends up being actually differs. And so I think that that point is really well taken and certainly very important to be able to consider those. And I would love if there was, probably is some way, you know, methodologically to develop a measure that would consider that, or, you know, with advanced, you know, models and things that are coming out now that might be able to help us answer those questions better.
Yeah, and you wonder about then tying that back into some of the measurement questions that Sarah was asking, you know, like at the
Yeah.
population level. So,
And interestingly, you know, some measures too, especially in the 0 to 6, they focus a lot on the child's outcome, right? And so will be like, oh, is the child doing this? Is the child doing that? Whereas I've often wondered, like, if we asked maybe 4 or 5 questions of the caregiver and how they're doing, I think we may actually get a really good understanding of how the kid's doing. Just because if there's a lot of upheaval there and a lot of challenge, it makes it hard for a child to be in a context where they're developing well.
yeah, it's so interesting from a population level. We've been looking at, I mean, this is because we have a lot of population health, the population-based healthcare data, and looking to integrate
Yeah.
some things from the education system. And when you see, you know, there's a lot of questionnaire-based data in the EQAO that kids fill out, and then parents do fill out forms. So you just wonder about the, you know, again, like trying to get this at scale, which you know, is both helpful from a research perspective when if you are trying to talk about, you know, analytics that are very like big data analytics, and
Yeah.
so both deep but also on a lot of people, but then also using it, you know, being able to use data that's just routinely collected, as opposed to having to like launch whole new data collection schemes that are just really expensive and all that. So anyway, just sort of leveraging where parents are already filling out, you know, forms and questionnaires about their kids and families. So, so yeah.
That's a really good idea.
Anyway, well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very, very much. It was a terrific talk, and I think it's given a lot of us lots to chew on, and really appreciate it, and hope that we are able to interact with you and your team at CHEO more